20 years at least, and the sales tax will follow it, probably not as bad. So if, why would you put such an essential government service on a less reliable funding source that grows actually slower than property taxes? That was one of the studies that we did. But the interesting study that we're going to talk about tonight, that we've really had a lot of fun with, when you hear about the swap and we have to do something more for schools, it's always driven by several things. The state's not doing its fair share, and somehow that's problematic for school budgets. All right? If only the state did more. Well, I can tell you that when you look at operating expenditures per pupil, it doesn't really matter to Quincy or Liberty or Minden whether 50% of that operating dollar came from the state or 30% of that operating dollar came from the state, as long as they got 100% of the operating dollars they need to produce a quality education. Okay? So and in the aggregate, this state is doing fine in terms of funding teachers, in terms of funding districts, in terms of funding just about everything. We are not a laggard in the aggregate. But the argument goes, if the state were only doing better and giving its fair share, somehow we would have a better fiscal situation for our 870 school districts. Well, we wanted to test that. They also say somehow that if the state did more, the gap between the richest and the poorest spending would be diminished. And intuitively, you would think that to be the case because the state does dump a lot of money into a student aid formula that is driven in part by the resources of the local districts. So you would think that that would have an impact. So we wanted to test that hypothesis. And then the third one was, more money, we got to do it for the kids because it's such a challenging educational environment out there, and we got to do better for the kids. So more money, better performance. Okay? So we wanted to test that. We went back over state revenues for state spending for education from 1981 forward. And between 1995 and 2002, we really spent a lot of money for education. A lot of money. You can see the overall revenue growth. Now this includes property taxes, state taxes, and federal taxes. The overall revenue growth for schools went from 11.7 billion to 18.5. State spending during that period almost doubled, 3.8 billion to 7.2 billion. The smallest state increase during that whole period was 5.3%. The largest state increase in 1999 actually was 16.6%. At that time, revenues were going through the roof. We were just clicking on all cylinders, and we actually had $1.4 billion in the bank at the end of one of those years. And our lapsed spending was $740 million because we had actually paid all of our Medicaid bills within 35 to 40 days. It was unbelievable. Those were the great times, and we spent a lot of money on education. Who's supposed to push the button for the next slide? Take it. I mean, this one's been up there for about a half hour. It's got to be horrible. Anyway, this shows basically what the actual spending was by administration, and I used the creative methodology that the Blagojevich folks used to spend their education commitment for the last 4 years. And actually, their figure does not correlate to the state board's own figures. It's a much rosier figure on that slide than it actually was. But even with smaller budget bases, Edgar's 4 years from 96 through 99, 2000 was 3.6 billion aggregate. Ryan spent it all, and he actually had a decrease in education spending in his last year. Otherwise, that figure would have been off the table. But it was basically between the Edgar and Ryan administrations, the last 4 years of Edgar's and the first 3 years of Ryan, that we chose to look at these spending increases and what kind of impacts that had on School district financials, the gap between the lowest and highest spending and performance. Could we, I could actually do that, but I'm trainable anyway. So this slide basically breaks it out, federal, state, and local, so you get a really good idea of what the individual components were during that period of time. Next slide. Revenue and expenditures, 1995 to 2002. As we indicated, this is actually out to the districts. This doesn't include the state stuff that went for pensions and others. These are actually figures that went out to the districts. In 1995, all of the districts in the state, roughly 900, had $11.8 billion in revenues, and they spent roughly 11.8, a little bit more. They spent $30 million more in 1995 than they took in. In 2002, however, you can see they spent $17.558 billion. State spending driving a lot of that. They received that in revenues, and they actually spent $19.5 billion. So they actually end, in the aggregate, $1.992 billion in the red. So the big number, aggregate, horrible. State spending drove big spending in schools, mostly through contracts, mostly teacher salaries, administrator salaries, and so on. The number of districts deficit spending in 1995 was 401. By 2002, 667 of the roughly 900 districts were deficit spending. Next. It happened across the board. You would expect that the poorest districts, there were, of the 50 poorest districts, 17 of them had budget deficits in 1995. Certainly 36 had budget deficits by 2002. In the richest districts, though, don't get comfortable. In the richest district, these are the ones that are spending $15,000, $16,000, $20,000 in 2002 per kid. In the richest district, they more than doubled. The increase of deficit spending was bigger in the richest districts than it was in the poorest. Next. When you look at it in the aggregate, it just sounds horrible. When you look at it right here in Sangamon County, it's not much of a different picture. It really isn't. You had 12 districts, and you still have 12 districts right here in Sangamon County. In 1995, the aggregate revenues for those 12 districts, with Springfield being by far and away the largest, $151 million. By 2002, those same districts spent $225 million, $74 million more, 49% increase in that period of time, right here in Sangamon County. Next slide. On the spending side, same 12 districts, they spent even more than the $74 million. Not that much more, but they did spend more. They spent about $700,000 more in the aggregate. Next slide. The number of districts in deficit in 1995 was 8. In 2002, 9 of them were operating in deficits. The aggregate deficit for the Sangamon County schools was $11.8 million versus $12.5 million in 2002. The bottom line, though, is why, with a $74 million increase, a 49% increase in revenues, would any of these districts have a deficit? Why would that even be? Next slide, please. Now, I guess I ought to sum it up on did all that spending help districts financially or not? And the answer is more districts were in the red after the end of the period than before it, and the amount of deficit at the end of the period was greater by far, not that much greater in Sangamon, but greater by far statewide than before. Now we're going to look at, did that big spend up have a noticeable impact